Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We've gotten a ton of requests recently to cover the rise of the new right in America and its lasting impact. And, well, today's the day we're diving into that. So we've got some fascinating excerpts from the American Yawp. This is a collaborative history textbook to help guide our deep dive today.
It's going to be interesting to look at this because it really wasn't just about a shift in politics. It was about a shift in how Americans saw themselves, their values, the role of government, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think to kick things off, a good place to start might be Ronald Reagan's landslide victory in 1980.
Hmm.
Now, was this really like the earthquake it seemed to be at the time, or had the ground been rumbling for a while, leading up to this?
Oh, the ground had definitely been rumbling for quite a while. I think Reagan's win was less a sudden shift and more the crest of a wave that had been building for decades, probably. To really understand it, we need to go back even further before Reagan and look at, how did a movement as potent as the New Right come to be? How did this happen?
So let me just make sure I'm following to Icon Spankle. Before Reagan, conservatism in America looked different.
Exactly. Post World War II, you had this more moderate conservatism that was largely accepting of the New Deal and, the kind of expanded role of government that it brought about. But
Oh,
right, no,
yeah.
no, they wanted to dismantle that. They believed in limited government free markets, a return to traditional social values. This was a different breed.
Okay, so this is really interesting. So who are the main players in this new right movement? I think a lot of times people tend to think of it as like one big block, but it sounds like it was more of a coalition.
You hit the nail on the head. It was a very diverse group. We're talking Christian conservatives who felt like their values were under attack, blue-collar workers who felt left behind by the, economic changes of the time, business leaders who were wary of government regulation, and even intellectuals who felt that, liberalism had lost its way. It was a broad tent.
Wow, that is a very interesting mix of people. So you have all these social and economic anxieties sort of converging at the same time. And, I've always heard this term Reagan Democrats, but honestly, I'm not really sure who they were and why they were important.
Ah, yes, the Reagan Democrats. Fascinating group. Imagine a blue-collar worker, let's say in the industrial Midwest, who had always voted Democrat, straight ticket, but he's starting to feel like the party doesn't represent him anymore. He's looking at them focusing on social issues that, maybe feel kind of distant to his everyday concerns while his job is disappearing overseas. That kind of person, that was the kind of person who became a Reagan Democrat, someone who was attracted to Reagan's message of economic opportunity, traditional values, strong national defense.
So the new right was really able to tap into this feeling of being left behind, like a sense that America was losing its way.
Yeah.
But, it seems like their ideas, at least at first, weren't exactly mainstream, right?
No, not at all. Think back to Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative, in 1964. His crushing defeat led many to believe that conservatism was a lost cause, that it was over. It's funny how what seemed like a death knell was actually the beginning of a slow burn.
So the 60s and 70s, with all that social upheaval and economic turmoil, actually laid the groundwork for the new right to gain traction.
Exactly. Those were turbulent times. We're talking the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, the rise of the counterculture, Watergate, all of it. It created this sense of anxiety and uncertainty, a feeling that the country was, maybe spiraling out of control. And for a lot of Americans, the new right's message of stability and a return to traditional values that started to resonate.
And then on top of all of that, you had stagflation, which just added fuel to the fire.
Absolutely. Stagflation, with its combination of economic stagnation and high inflation, it really shook people's faith in the government's ability to manage the economy. The old solutions didn't seem to be working, and the new right was ready with a new set of answers.
It's really amazing how this sense of crisis can kind of create an opening for new ideas to take root.
And speaking of, tapping into anxieties, the story of George Wallace always fascinates me. You have this staunch segregationist, a Democrat no less, who manages to attract support from working class white voters even in the North. What was it about his message that resonated so strongly with those voters?
Well, Wallace was a master at exploiting the fears and anxieties of white voters who felt threatened by the rapid pace of social and economic change. They saw the civil rights movement, the gains made by African Americans. They saw this as a threat to their own status and way of life. They were anxious about, economic uncertainty, the loss of jobs, rising cost of living, all of that.
So it was this mix of economic populism and social conservatism that almost like foreshadowed the realignment of party loyalties that we see later on. Precisely. And while Wallace himself never actually attained national office, His success really demonstrated the power of this combination, this potent combination of economic and social anxieties, anxieties that Richard Nixon would later capitalize on with his law and order and silent majority rhetoric.
It's so interesting how these figures, even with all their flaws, they often tap into something deeper, this kind of unease that's simmering beneath the surface. And the new right, they were particularly good at harnessing that energy and turning it into a political force.
They really were, and I think a key factor in their success was the rise of Christian conservatism and its entry into the political arena.
Right, yeah. It's hard to imagine the new right without figures like Phyllis Schlafly and Beverly LaHaye. They really galvanized conservative women around issues like opposition to the ERA and abortion.
Absolutely. They framed these issues as attacks on traditional family values, tapping into these deep-seated anxieties about the changing roles of women in society and the perceived decline of the traditional family.
And then the Roe v. Wade ruling in 1973, legalizing abortion nationwide, that really poured gasoline on the fire.
Oh, it did. For many evangelical Protestants, Roe v. Wade was a wake-up call. They saw it as a direct assault on their religious beliefs and a sign that they needed to get involved in politics to protect their values. Figures like Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, they really understood how to mobilize this energy, turning cultural anxieties into votes and political influence.
So it's fascinating how they were able to connect these very specific social issues to a much broader narrative about the decline of America and the need for a moral revival.
And it wasn't just social issues. The new right was also finding fertile ground in the economic anxieties of the late 1970s, and this is where Jimmy Carter's presidency comes in.
Okay, so wait, Carter. A Democrat actually lays the groundwork for the Reagan Revolution. How does that happen?
Well, it's interesting because despite being a Democrat, Carter implemented some policies that were actually quite conservative, driven by his own beliefs in this, broader climate of disillusionment with government. He deregulated industries like airlines and trucking, pushed for a balanced budget, and appointed Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve, who, implemented very strict anti-inflation measures.
So it's almost like he's putting some of the new rights ideas into practice, even though he's coming at it from a completely different perspective.
Exactly. And I think in a way, he inadvertently helped to legitimize these ideas and, create a space for Reagan to come in and take them even further.
So unknowingly paving the way for the conservative revolution that was about to sweep the nation.
And there was another key event during Carter's presidency that played right into the new right's hands. The controversy surrounding the IRS and segregated schools.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that. Wasn't that about the IRS revoking the tax-exempt status of private schools that discriminated on the basis of race?
That's exactly right. And while it might seem like it was just about taxes, this controversy tapped into these deeper anxieties about race, religion, government overreach. The new right was very skillfully able to frame it as a case of the federal government meddling in the affairs of religious institutions, infringing on religious freedom and pushing a liberal social agenda.
So it became this rallying point, not just for those opposed to desegregation, but also for those who are generally just wary of government intervention in their lives.
Exactly. And it further solidified the new right space and helped them to build a broader coalition of voters who were ready for change. They're ready for something different.
So by 1980, you had this perfect storm brewing, right? Economic woes, a sense of national decline after Vietnam and the Iran hostage crisis, and all these anxieties about social and cultural change swirling around. And then into this maelstrom steps Ronald Reagan, this charismatic former actor with a message of optimism and strength. What was it about Reagan that allowed him to capture the moment so effectively?
Well, I think Reagan was just a master communicator. He had this uncanny ability to connect with people on an emotional level, to tap into their anxieties and offer these seemingly simple solutions. He promised to restore American pride and prosperity by cutting taxes, shrinking the government, taking a tough stance against the Soviet Union. It was a message that resonated very deeply with voters who were tired of the status quo and hungry for change.
And that famous question he asked during the 1980 debate with Carter, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" That really captured the national mood.
It did. It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of the matter. And for many Americans, the answer was a resounding no. They were struggling economically, they felt like the country was adrift, and they were ready for a new direction.
And Reagan was offering that new direction, a vision of a stronger, more prosperous, more confident America.
It's amazing to think how all these different threads, social anxieties, the economic woes, the political maneuvering, all converge to create this pivotal moment in American history. It really is. And, the 1980 election wasn't just about choosing a new president. It was a referendum on the direction of the country. It was a rejection of the New Deal order that had dominated American politics for nearly half a century, and a resounding endorsement of the new right's vision for America.
Okay, so the stage is set. The new right has triumphed. Reagan is in the White House. What happens next? Well, for that, you'll have to join us for part 2 of our deep dive. All right, so we left off with Reagan taking the oath of office, the new rights champion, ready to kind of reshape America. And it really felt like a revolution was in the air. Did the changes come as fast and furiously as his supporters had hoped?
Oh, he definitely hit the ground running. I mean, you'll recall that famous line from his inaugural address, right? Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And that really did set the tone for his entire presidency. It was a clear signal that, the era of big government was over.
Talk about a rallying cry. But beyond that rhetoric, how did they actually try to, shrink government? I remember hearing a lot about supply-side economics back then, but honestly, I'm not sure I totally get it.
Well, imagine the economy as a car. Okay, so Keynesian economics, which was popular, in the decades after the New Deal, that was all about stepping on the gas pedal, stimulating demand to get the car moving. Supply-side economics, on the other hand, was about tuning up the engine.
Okay, so instead of just boosting spending, they wanted to make the system run better.
Exactly. The idea was that if you reduce taxes, especially for businesses and higher earners, that would free up capital for investment and lead to increased production. And they argue that this would create jobs. Lower prices ultimately benefit everyone, even those who didn't directly get the tax cuts.
Ah, okay, so the famous trickle-down effect, like a rising tide lifts all boats. But wasn't there some pushback on that idea, even from some Republicans?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny, George H.W. Bush even called it voodoo economics during the 1980 primaries. But, Reagan, he was a true believer, and he managed to get a massive tax cut package through Congress in 1981.
I bet that made his supporters in the business world very happy.
Yeah.
What about his relationship with organized labor, though? I mean, I know he had a union background himself, right?
He did. Reagan had actually led the Screen Actors Guild for years. But as president, his stance towards unions really took a dramatic turn, and the Pat T strike in 1981, that really kind of marked that shift.
Remind me about that one. It had to do with air traffic controllers, right?
Yeah, so the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Union, they went on strike demanding better pay and working conditions. And, this was during a time of, really heightened Cold War tensions, and Reagan saw this as a threat to national security. He took a very hard line, firing over 11,000 controllers who refused to return to work.
Wow, that's a bold move. It really sent a message that he wasn't messing around. But I also remember that, his first term was economically pretty rough. Yeah. Things didn't exactly go as planned.
Yeah, it was a rocky start for sure.
Yeah.
The economy actually went into a really deep recession, unemployment soared, and even some conservatives started to question his policies.
Well, yeah. It seems kind of strange, right? Cutting taxes while also dramatically increasing military spending to confront the Soviets. Didn't all that contribute to this, ballooning national debt?
It absolutely did. And at the same time, you had Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve, who was continuing the anti-inflation policies that he actually started under Carter. So interest rates were sky high, which did help curb inflation, but also contributed to the economic downturn.
So it was a bunch of things going on at once, not just Reagan's policies, that created this economic turmoil.
All right, it was a very complex situation. And then you also had Reagan's cuts to social welfare programs, which were driven by, that new right belief in smaller government. And those cuts had a real impact, especially on the poor and working class, which further fueled that criticism that Reaganomics was, favoring the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans.
So you had this weird thing happening, right? Booming Wall Street, the rise of these corporate raiders and junk bonds, all this wealth being generated. But at the same time, poverty rates were increasing. It seems like that inequality is a big part of the Reagan era's legacy.
Yeah, it's a central tension for sure, this narrative of prosperity, but for whom? And the Democrats really hammered that home in the 1982 midterms. They made really big gains in Congress.
It's amazing, though, how Reagan was able to kind of weather all those storms. He always seemed to come out on top no matter what.
Well, he had this almost uncanny ability to connect with people even when they disagreed with him. And he wasn't afraid to change course when necessary. After he faced some real backlash for his cuts to Social Security, he ended up appointing a bipartisan commission that ended up strengthening the program.
Yeah.
And that allowed him to take credit for, saving it.
That was pretty shrewd. And then, of course, the economy started to recover just in time for his reelection campaign in 1984.
Morning in America, that's what they called it. And that image of optimism really resonated with voters, even if the reality was, a little more complicated than that. Reagan's victory over Walter Mondale was a landslide. He won 49 out of 50 states. It was a clear mandate for his vision of America.
Wasn't there also kind of an interesting ideological shift happening within the Democratic Party around this time?
Yeah, there was. You had figures like Gary Hart, who represented this new breed of new Democrats who were more fiscally conservative and less focused on that traditional, New Deal liberalism.
Hmm.
And it was a direct response to the success of the new right, a recognition that they needed to adapt to this new political landscape if they wanted to be successful.
So the new right's influence was shaping both parties,
Yeah.
even if in different ways. It's remarkable how their ideas had kind of infiltrated the mainstream.
It really is. And this really paved the way for the rise of figures like Bill Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Council, who explicitly aimed to move the party away from its traditional base of labor unions and towards a more centrist pro-business approach.
It's a pretty long-term impact. So Reagan wins the second term. The new right's influence is growing, but their work is far from over. Let's dig into those later years and their legacy when we come back for the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so we're back for the final chapter of our deep dive into the rise of the new Joe. Right, we've covered so much already, from Reagan's economic policies, his stance on unions, to even the ideological shifts that were happening in both major parties. But I'm thinking, what about the impact on just everyday Americans? It seems like the Reagan years were this time of stark contrast with both progress and struggle kind of happening at the same time.
Yeah, no, it was a very complicated time for sure, I think, to really kind of understand that we could look at the experiences of African Americans during that era. On the one hand, you have these significant strides in politics and culture. I mean, Harold Washington became Chicago's first black mayor in 1983, and then Jesse Jackson's presidential runs in 1984 and 88. While they were ultimately unsuccessful, they really energized black voters and showed this growing political power.
And, in pop culture, you had icons like Michael Jackson, Eddie Murphy, Oprah Winfrey breaking down barriers and achieving just phenomenal success.
Yeah.
It really felt like a time of genuine possibility.
It did, but at the same time, many African Americans were still grappling with persistent economic disparities and, just systemic racism, Reagan's cuts to social programs, the broader economic shifts of the 1980s, those hit black communities particularly hard.
So while there was progress at the top, the reality for many working-class African Americans was much different.
Exactly. The poverty rate stayed really high, and black unemployment continued to be double that of whites. It was like this tale of two realities,
And wasn't the war on drugs another factor that really disproportionately impacted black communities?
It was. While it was framed as, a way to combat crime and drug abuse, the war on drugs really often led to over-policing in black neighborhoods and this mass incarceration of black men, a trend that we're still dealing with the consequences of today.
Yeah, for sure. It's a reminder that even during these periods of, what people perceive as prosperity, these deep inequalities can still persist. And speaking of, cultural clashes, the 80s were really the peak of the culture wars, right? It felt like every issue, from music to movies to family values, just became so intensely politicized.
Absolutely. This was a time of really heightened anxiety about social change and the perceived decline of traditional values. It was really a battle over who got to define American identity and values.
I remember Tipper Gore, the Parents Music Resource Center, trying to get warning labels put on albums.
Mhm.
They were arguing that rock music was corrupting America's youth. It all seems so kind of quaint now, but at the time it felt like this major battle.
It did. And of course, abortion continued to be a major flashpoint. The pro-life movement became much more vocal and confrontational with groups like Operation Rescue, using really aggressive tactics to try to shut down abortion clinics.
Yeah, and it's interesting how these cultural battles, they were about so much more than just the specific issues at hand, right? They were really about power, control, the future of America.
Exactly. And, they exposed these deep divisions within American society that I think we're still grappling with today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about Reagan's foreign policy. He came into office with this really strong anti-communist stance, famously calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. What was driving that worldview?
I think Reagan truly believed that the Soviet Union posed this, existential threat to American values and interests. He saw it as this global battle between good and evil, and, he was determined to win.
And he definitely put his money where his mouth was. I mean, I remember the massive increase in military spending, the Star Wars missile defense program, the support for these anti-communist movements around the world. It felt like we were constantly kind of on a war footing.
It did. And while some people criticized his approach as reckless and provocative, it really resonated with a lot of Americans who were eager to reassert American power on the world stage after, what they perceived as the setbacks of the 1970s.
And then, of course, there's the Iran-Contra affair, which almost completely derailed his presidency.
That was a fascinating episode, sure. I mean, this whole secret arms deal with Iran, the proceeds of which were then used to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, all done, in defiance of Congress. It was a classic Cold War scandal with all the, intrigue and moral ambiguity that implies.
It really is amazing that he was able to survive that politically. But it's kind of a strange twist. The president who'd been so hawkish towards the Soviets actually ended up playing a key role in easing those Cold War tensions. All those summits with Gorbachev, the INF Treaty, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was such a remarkable turnaround.
It really was. And, while there were certainly other factors at play, I think Reagan's willingness to engage with Gorbachev and, that vision of a world without nuclear weapons, I think those contributed to that historic shift.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the lasting legacy of the new right and, the Reagan Revolution? It's a complicated question, to say the least.
It is very complicated. The new right really reshaped the political landscape in America. They shifted the center of gravity to the right, and they left this, indelible mark on both major parties. They achieved many of their goals: tax cuts, deregulation, a much more muscular foreign policy. But their legacy is also one of rising inequality, this cultural division, and, shrinking social safety net.
Yeah, it really is kind of a mixed bag, isn't it? The end of the Cold War, the economic boom of the 80s, a renewed sense of national pride. Those are all part of the story. But so are the social costs, the widening gap between rich and poor, and that erosion of trust in government.
And, the debates that they ignited about the role of government, individual liberty versus social responsibility, even like the very definition of American values, those are still shaping our political discourse today.
It is fascinating to see how all these ideas that seemed so radical at the time, have become just so deeply embedded in our politics and culture.
It really makes you wonder what future historians will say about our current moment. What will they see as the defining forces that are shaping this era? What's going to be the lasting legacy of the choices that we're making today?
Well, those are questions we'll have to grapple with on another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everybody.